Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. Yes, yeah. The government and people have something in common. Yes, yeah.
46% of people, 20 million people, live on less than £140 a month. And despite those connections that I pointed out, there was a very important and controversial, has to be added, major research project supported by South African trade unions, and I think it was the Canadian government, in 2002, the Municipal Service Project, which, based on its surveys, extrapolated figures to show that, yes, there's been all these fantastic connections, but actually, because the government introduced what was called cost recovery services for the connections for water, telephones, electricity, and I'll come on to that a little bit in a minute, people couldn't afford, because of the unemployment, because of the poverty levels, to pay their electricity bills, to pay their council bills, if you like, for municipal housing, to pay for the telephone once it's been connected. So, whilst millions have been connected, something like 10 million people have been affected by a water cut-off at a certain point in time since 1994. 10 million people have been affected by having their electricity cut off since 1994. And nearly half of the 2 million phone lines which were extended and given to predominantly black people have been disconnected and have been reconnected because people couldn't afford to pay their bills. So again, we need to really interrogate the official statistics and peer behind the sort of veneer of reality of life in South Africa since 1994. The Municipal Services Project also found out that of the people who have been connected to water that the government were very proud of, that included people who had a standpipe put in their streets, not taps into their house. So of the millions that were connected, it didn't mean everybody had a tap and a sink in their house, but they had access to water. Some of them may have had to walk for that, some of them may have had to walk down the streets and still carry it back as well. The report also found out that there were lots of poorly maintained water pipes and water connections. So there was a loss of water, and so there were huge inefficiencies in water delivery, and standpipes and water connections are broken down as well. Okay, unemployment for young people in South Africa is a particular problem. This is a country where something like 50% of people are probably under the age of 25, and youth is a very important category, not only because politically in South African history in terms of the Soweto revolt, but particularly today because it is such a young country. But unemployment rates for people who've done what's called matric, which is sort of similar to A-levels in South Africa, have gone from 25% in 1994 to 40%. So a huge increase in unemployment. So whilst some black people and young people have got access to school and stayed on and managed to do A-levels, when they leave, there's no jobs for 40% of them. For those who went to tertiary education, which is sort of FE and HE if you like, unemployment rate went from 6, that should be 50 to 15%. So it doubled until about 2005. In terms of workers, the South African workers have become amongst the top 4 most productive workers in the world since the end of apartheid, but their wages are still very, very poor. The average wage probably around something like £180 a month, 23,500 rand. Yeah, a Labour Force survey, official government survey, revealed in 2005 that the executive directors got something like 4 million, roughly £400,000 a year on average, compared to the average worker who got about £200 wages a month. Other problems since 1994, just to give you an idea of context before we go into more detail. 2000-2001 was a huge cholera epidemic broke out in KwaZulu-Natal, spread to other parts of the country. At the time, this was the worst outbreak of cholera in Africa. Don't forget, South Africa is the most economically developed, the richest country in Africa. Yet it had one of Africa's worst recent cholera outbreaks, which left 117 people dead. One of the reasons why this happened was because of the government's cost recovery programs that have been introduced. People couldn't even afford the £2 a month maintenance fee, so they were cut off. And of course, with water disconnections, it gave rise to a spread of cholera. Despite that, every year, something like 42,000 children, black children, die of diarrhea and waterborne and preventable diseases in South Africa. And this is, again, a structural feature of life for many poor, black, particularly rural children in South Africa. As I said before, despite the economic boom that took place in the last few years, since the recession kicked in last year in South Africa, it was slightly delayed. about 1 million jobs have been lost in South Africa in the last year alone. Initial predictions said it would be 500,000, it's in fact doubled to 1 million jobs in the last year alone. Again, nobody can talk about HIV and AIDS, or talk about HIV and AIDS, but just to give you a quick overview, there are something like 5.5 million people with HIV AIDS in South Africa. Roughly 11% of the population, slightly higher for women, and normally the average person with HIV positive is a black 24 to 25-year-old working class woman. Estimates are, these are all estimates, but certainly they're not so far off the mark. Something like 2.5 million people have died of AIDS since 1994. And at any one time, there are about 500,000 people who are HIV positive, where their infection rate has got so bad that they're in need of urgent medical attention, antiretroviral drugs, ARVs. But only roughly about half of them have got access to these drugs as well. HIV, AIDS, poverty and the problems I've outlined have led to a massive reduction in life expectancy in South Africa. So in 1985, life expectancy was 61 years of age. Quite high for Africa, very poor by Western standards. It's now dropped massively to 50 years of age as average life expectancy in the richest African country, richest country in Africa. Okay, so why has this happened? Well, as I said earlier, it's very important to remember that the victory for the South African working class was our victory. Everybody in the world did rightly applaud the victory of the ANC in bringing in liberal democracy. However critical we might be of socialist or liberal democracy, it was a massive step forward for the black South African working class. And the black South African working class was central to the victory over apartheid. And if those of you around remember back to that time, the victory against apartheid offered a beacon of hope to the left, both in South Africa, across the continent and internationally, at a time when it was very difficult to be a socialist. Mandela not only carried the hopes of a nation, he carried the hopes of a world, I think, in 1994. The South African working class, we must remind ourselves, was absolutely and fundamentally central to the defeat of apartheid. This is a regime, don't forget, that was armed with nuclear weapons, was armed to the teeth, was completely authoritarian and backed by every major Western power. Yet the black South African working class brought it to its knees and defeated it. And that's something we must never, ever forget. But, and there is a big but, the election of the ANC with something like 63% of the vote, which has gone to about 69% in the last election a year ago, came at a huge cost. The cost that I presented there, but also the political cost, was that the ANC has never proclaimed to be a socialist party. It has socialists and Marxists in it, particularly from the South African Communist Party. But the ANC is a nationalist party, and its politics have been predicated on, rightfully and understandably, wanting to manage its corner of the globe that was denied under apartheid. The ANC wanted to manage South African capitalism in the interests of South Africans. And that means all South Africans, irrespective of race and irrespective of class. The ANC has been, and still is today, a multi-class alliance made up of its rank-and-file members, of black working-class people, lots of trade unionists, supported in its tripart alliance by the Confederation of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, and supported politically by the South African Communist Party, which today is claiming up to something like 150,000 members. This alliance was brought together and welded together by the multi-class cross-class alliance politics of the ANC. And Mandela is on record and long on record as saying that the ANC has never professed to be in a socialist organisation. It is an African nationalist organisation, so it seeks to rule in the interests of the South African ruling class. But it was a ruling class for many years that was denied black people its rightful access to be middle class or part of the ruling class.